What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here, back to offer my review for A Complete Unknown from director James Mangold, starring Timothée Chalamet. And not to worry, in spite of my little outfit, I will not be singing any Bob Dylan tunes on this video. Timothée Chalamet's got us covered on that front, but I saw it last night down at the Alamo Drafthouse in Lower Manhattan, and they were handing out free copies of the album The Free Will and Bob Dylan. I was like, well, shit. That's as good a gimmick as I have seen when it comes to getting people in the mood to enjoy a movie-going experience, but I don't even own a record player. But luckily my dad does, so I'll be offering this as an additional Christmas present to him this year. But let's get the most important details out of the way first. Timothée Chalamet pulled it off. Like, the big question is with these biopics, I guess there's always two big questions. Is it just going to be a formulaic kind of generic biopic from rags to riches, birth to death, blah, blah, blah? And on that front, no, it just covers 1961 to 1965. Basically, the point where Bob Dylan starts to explode, right up to the point where he goes electric and makes the entire folk music community just go fucking berserk. And that material's all been covered in the fantastic documentary Don't Look Back by D.A. Pennebaker, which gets my highest possible recommendation. But the other big question with biopics always is it going to be a character or a caricature? And it's very easy to slip into caricature when a persona like Bob Dylan has so many well-known mannerisms. And anyway, people have been imitating him for a long time. And the Todd Haynes film, I'm Not There, from 2007, gave several actors a chance to kind of do like their rendition of all those Bob Dylan quirks and mannerisms. And Cate Blanchett turned out to be a pretty goddamn good actor when it comes to impersonating the young Bob Dylan. But Timothée Chalamet, I'd say about 5 or 10 minutes into the movie, I stopped thinking about it as Timothée Chalamet impersonating Bob Dylan, and I just started enjoying the Bob Dylan story of the early 60s. And I'm not going to claim that this is my favorite musical biopic that I've ever seen. That distinction will probably always belong to Amadeus, which is just an earth-shattering movie, which I've seen over and over and over again. But I'd say this movie's about on the level of a biopic like The Doors by Oliver Stone, which I saw at the perfect age where I knew none of the music of The Doors going into the movie The Doors. And by the end of it, I was a fan of The Doors and started buying their albums. And, throughout all of high school, I basically was obsessed with The Doors, thanks to Oliver Stone. And I hope a similar phenomenon will take place here with A Complete Unknown, because we're talking about music at this point, which is more or less kind of ancient history when it comes to pop culture. It's 60-year-old music, and there are not a lot of 18 or 19-year-old kids who are like, hey, I want to sit around listening to folk music from the early 60s. But my hope is that there will be some people who just find Timothée Chalamet to be so dreamy that they'll fall in love with the movie and then, start getting into the music of Bob Dylan. And as far as my own interest in Bob Dylan is concerned, I love Bob Dylan, but I recognize that there are people who have much more enthusiasm and much more knowledge, because my roommate in high school or boarding school, my junior and senior year, the great John McGugan Martin, a.k.a. Pettibone, he was obsessed with Bob Dylan, and through him, I discovered a lot of Bob Dylan's best albums. Like, I don't know how many nights we went to sleep just listening to Blood on the Tracks over and over and over again. We'd kind of wake up in the middle of the night, and Tangled Up in Blue would still be playing. Oh, shit, maybe I ought to press stop on this goddamn CD. But we spent hour after hour listening to Bob Dylan's best albums from the 60s and 70s back in the early 90s when I was in high school, especially box sets like Bob Dylan, the Bootleg Series, volumes 1 through 3, which came out at that time and is absolutely floored all of us. And at that time, Bob Dylan seemed old to us, but he was 30 years younger. And I saw him perform with the Grateful Dead in the summer of 1995. And even though he seemed like he was 150,000 years old to my eyes in 1995, he was still relatively young and vigorous, or at least compared to now. But one of my favorite memories from that period is when my buddy John and I went to see the Rolling Stones Voodoo Lounge Tour. But as we were leaving, we were listening to some compilation of Bob Dylan music, because the song Positively 4th Street came on, which was released as a single back in the 60s. But my buddy John was so into that song, he just hung his head out the window and was just singing along with that music as we were driving out, basically fighting traffic. So anyway, Bob Dylan was a big part of my life in high school. But in college, I started discovering movies like Don't Look Back, which I saw in the theater at a revival at the New Art in L.A. And then I discovered Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, which is one of my all-time favorite movies. A strong contender for my number one movie that I would take to a desert island if I could only take one movie. But Bob Dylan did the entire score for Sam Peckinpah and plays the role of Alias Anything You Please.
Alias what?
Alias anything you please.
What do we call you?
Alias.
Hell, just call him Alias.
That's what I'd do.
And one of my favorite stories about the behind the scenes on that is when Sam Peckinpah was unfamiliar with his music and basically had Bob Dylan audition for him, even though he was this massive superstar. And apparently at the end of the audition, Peckinpah came out of the room crying and was like, "That son of a bitch." Like, he had been unexpectedly moved by the music. But if you want to check out Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, make sure you check out the 1988 Turner preview cut, which is the best version of the movie. And that cut is actually not on the Criterion Collection Blu-ray. I own the Criterion Collection Blu-ray. I love the Criterion Collection Blu-ray. But if you want to see the 1988 Turner preview version, which is the most superior version of that movie, reach out to me on Twitter at Colbrax. I will gladly send you a link because I may or may not have ripped that version from the DVD and posted it on Vimeo. But let's get back to A Complete Unknown, because in the end, this is a review of an actual movie, not just me reminiscing about the music of Bob Dylan. But at the end of this video, I'll throw out some recommendations for my favorite albums if you are a youngin' and you're unfamiliar with his music. And also, I think I need to take off this gear because as much as I'm a fan of committing to the bit, as they say, that wig is very itchy and it's very distracting. And I can't read my goddamn notes on my computer if I'm wearing these fucking sunglasses, although I'm glad to have these sunglasses. In any case, let's get into things. I think the moments that'll make or break the movie for people will be the scenes where Bob Dylan and Joan Baez are performing together and harmonizing. That's a huge part of this movie, where she's already on the cover of Time magazine when Bob Dylan's first being discovered, and she helps popularize a lot of his music. And when it comes to the Greenwich Village kind of folk scene of the early 60s, she's already an absolute goddess at that time. But I live very close to all the locations featured in this movie. Maybe my one big criticism of the movie is that they recreate McDougal, and it's not McDougal. I mean, McDougal's where you've got Cafe Wah, where Bob Dylan used to play back in the day, and right around the corner are some of the venues on Bleecker Street. I used to live at 177 Bleecker Street, so I know that neighborhood well. And as the scenes on Bleecker and McDougal started to unfold in the movie, I was like, wait a second, the street's way too wide, and where are all the recognizable landmarks and that sort of thing? So if you know the village well, you might cry foul at the lack of authenticity. But I think they really they needed to strip away some of the more modern buildings that are there these days. But apart from that, I don't really have any major criticisms of the movie, because when actress Monica Barbaro as Joan Baez starts harmonizing with Timothée Chalamet, I started getting chills with each and every single song. I mean, even early on when Timothée Chalamet's character of Bob Dylan comes to visit Woody Guthrie in the hospital just to sing a song for him and just to basically tell him how much his music has meant to him, I started getting chills there. And apparently Timothée Chalamet spent years practicing. He basically used all of COVID in order to practice and get prepared. And apparently he worked with the same team of vocal and movement coaches that worked with Austin Butler to get prepared for Elvis. And I think if you were to compare the two movies, I think A Complete Unknown is better than Elvis. Elvis, like, the big failure of Elvis is that in the first half of the movie, they're using a ton of music from the 21st century. I'm like, what the fuck? Like, you're depicting the 50s and the 60s. Maybe just lean into the 50s and 60s, but Baz Luhrmann is a very trashy filmmaker in a lot of ways. Although I did like Austin Butler's performance in Elvis. I'd say A Complete Unknown is better than Rocketman. I would say it's better than Bohemian Rhapsody. I mean, we've had a lot of musical biopics lately, some that are better than others. But I think what helps distinguish this movie from some other more conventional biopics is that it's based on a book, which I must confess I have not read, a 2015 book called Dylan Goes Electric by Elijah Wald. But as far as screenwriting goes, James Mangold brought in Jay Cox to write it with him, and I think that was a masterstroke on his part. Jay Cox has written a couple movies for Martin Scorsese, movies like Gangs in New York, but he was born in the 40s, so he was in his 20s when Bob Dylan was exploding in New York. And Jay Cox, as well as Martin Scorsese, obviously are rock and roll fanatics. Martin Scorsese actually did a really good documentary on Bob Dylan called No Direction Home. But back when No Direction Home came out on DVD, I had one day where I was so hungover I wanted to die, and I just collapsed on the couch and I watched the entire documentary from start to finish. It's like 6 hours long or 7 hours long, but if you were dying from a hangover and like Bob Dylan music, well then check out No Direction Home. But luckily, there are a lot of good movies out there with music by Bob Dylan, and obviously a lot of good movies out there about Bob Dylan. And now we've got one more to add to the mix. And I guess my biggest question is not necessarily will it convert the youngins into new fans for Bob Dylan, but how will the fanatics feel? As I was mentioning earlier, my buddy John Martin, his wife likes Bob Dylan even more than he does. When they were on a road trip once, he had to limit the number of songs per day that she was allowed to play by Bob Dylan. So it's like if she was putting even his rabid interest to the test, well, then it just shows you how obsessed she is with the great Bob Dylan. But I don't know how people are going to feel, because if you have strong opinions about Bob Dylan, but you're skeptical about Timothée Chalamet bringing him to life, I think that's totally valid. I mean, Timothée Chalamet is a, young, sexy movie star, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of people probably think that he's going to not necessarily get at like the essence of the character. I'll say this. Early on, when Timothée Chalamet's portraying kind of like the starry-eyed, idealistic Bob Dylan, or he's not even really that starry-eyed or idealistic, but the inexperienced Bob Dylan when he freshly has arrived in New York, perhaps people will look through that and say, oh, this does feel more like caricature. I think that might be a little bit unfair, but where he makes the switch, or where he finds that special gear, that special groove, is when Bob Dylan starts to become insanely popular. Like when he can't even go to a club anymore without people like, ripping his clothes off and just like pawing at him. And when the whole folk music scene starts, almost like in a parasitic way, trying to turn him into the poster child for a style of music that he does not want to be limited to, because he likes country and folk and blues and rock and roll and all this stuff, and he doesn't want to be limited just to music about the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and that sort of thing. But as he becomes this kind of overnight sensation, and he's got people like Johnny Cash talking about how Free Will and Bob Dylan is like his most prized possession at that point, where he starts dressing all in black and letting his hair get a little more crazy. He leaves the cap aside, starts wearing shades wherever he goes. That's where Timothée Chalamet really shines, because that's a world that he understands. Timothée Chalamet, I mean, he hangs out with the Kardashians. He's Paul Atreides himself. He had massive hits in the theater at the same time with two different movies, Wonka as well as Dune Part 2. Wonka I thought was dreadful. I mean, I went to see Wonka, and during the opening credits, I had to leave the movie. As soon as he started singing in Wonka, I was like, oh, that's the style of music this movie employs. I'm out. Luckily, he's singing music that is more to my taste in A Complete Unknown. And while no one can sing precisely like Bob Dylan, I feel like he does more or less a pretty good job of capturing that style of singing. There's one scene where he's particularly good. It's during the Cuban Missile Crisis. People are freaking out. Everybody's debating whether or not they should flee for the hills. And Joan Baez is thinking the same thing, but she walks by a club and sees Bob Dylan in there singing Masters of War, and she just kind of comes on down to listen to the music. And during that scene, Timothée Chalamet really shines singing that one particular song. But when they're on stage at the Newport, I think it's just called the Newport Folk Festival. I can't remember the exact name, but they perform at the Newport Festival over and over and over again as they lead up to that fateful day where he wants to go electric on stage, and all the folk enthusiasts, freak the fuck out. But when they're on stage together singing and looking to each other's eyes, and it's an interesting bit of chemistry they have, because they are sexually attracted to each other, but they're also rivals. And she is the queen of the folk music scene, and he's the undisputed king, but he's slowly drifting away. And so it just creates a really interesting dynamic. And that dynamic is further explored with some of the other major figures from the folk and country scene at that time. Boyd Holbrook does a pretty goddamn good job as Johnny Cash, and I thought it would have been interesting if James Mangold had brought back Joaquin Phoenix to play Johnny Cash, but Joaquin's probably aged out of the early 60s era of Johnny Cash. But Boyd Holbrook did a good job. Nobody can perfectly imitate that signature voice of Johnny Cash, but I feel like when it comes to kind of the drunken swagger of that time, Boyd did a good job. And Ed Norton did a pretty good job as Pete Seeger. I worried a little bit that Ed Norton was going to hide behind yet another accent. I love Ed Norton as an actor, but he has a bad habit of kind of hiding behind these really specific accents that don't necessarily feel all that authentic at times. But Pete Seeger, I think he got into the swing of things, and he's playing the banjo in those scenes in the movie. All the actors in this movie, they are singing, they are playing their instruments. They all were really dedicated to their craft. And Scoot McNairy is pretty good as Woody Guthrie as well. He doesn't get to talk all that much, because Woody Guthrie, by the time you get to the early 60s, Woody Guthrie is really, really sick. But his son, Arlo Guthrie, was a huge favorite of mine back in the 1960s. I mean, coming into Los Angeles and all that stuff, I used to sing Arlo Guthrie music while driving on my car all the goddamn time. So if you're into folk, country, blues, etc. from the early 60s, I think you're just going to be, having like one orgasm after another for the 2-hour and 20-minute runtime. But if you're not into this style of music, it might be a tough sit, or you might be in for a tough slog. But for me, I was a very easy lay for this movie. I love this kind of music. And so, yeah, I was just enthralled every step of the way. if I try to put on my kind of, I guess, more rigorous film criticism hat and just judge it as a movie or as a story, some might regard this movie as a little bit of like a storm within a teacup, because when you think back to the 1960s and the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement and that sort of thing, like the debate over whether or not Bob Dylan should go electric might seem a little bit, I guess, insignificant compared to the larger issues at that time. But people did freak out, and the folk music scene was trying to build something big that would last for many decades to come. And Bob Dylan just feels very confined by that, and especially with all the peer pressure by his fellow artists who are like they from like Bob Dylan's point of view, they just want him to keep singing "Blowing in the Wind" for the rest of his life. But he's in his 20s and he wants to play rock and roll with his buddies in a band and that sort of thing. And he wants to be open to any kind of music, that might involve like organs or keyboards or electric guitars or whatever. And people just lost their goddamn minds. However, in hindsight, Highway 61 Revisited became a pretty landmark album. When I was in high school, I would drive around listening to Highway 61 Revisited on a loop. It has so many good songs on it. But, the folk albums are cool too. I like all the various evolutions and changes in Bob Dylan's work throughout the 60s and 70s. My favorite album by him remains Blood on the Tracks, and Blood on the Tracks is absolutely just like sends like tremors through my soul when I listen to it. But Desire is a good one as well. The Basement Tapes, when Bob Dylan's playing with the band, is really cool. And what's great about his affiliation with the band, it obviously leads to his appearance in the film The Last Waltz, directed by Martin Scorsese, where Bob Dylan comes out and sings like Forever Young and things like that. And it's just absolutely incredible. Blonde on Blonde is a really good one. I was listening to Blonde on Blonde this morning, and I was just, singing right along with the Stuck Inside a Mobile with the Memphis Blues again. I mean, that song is just an absolute banger. And then John Wesley Harding is a fantastic one as well. He was just a songwriting machine throughout the 1960s. And when you watch interviews with him now, he says he can't write like that anymore. He can't even come close to writing like that anymore. He says there was like a strange alchemical magic at play at that time where he was just cranking out like songs by the yard. And I remember seeing an interview with Joan Baez. I think this was the No Direction Home, where she talked about how he would be just throwing away scraps of ideas for songs, and she would at one point she started playing one of those scraps back to him. He was like, he's like that song's pretty good. Like when did you write that? She's like, Bob, like you wrote this yourself. Like you're just throwing away lyrics that for other people would be complete and total solid gold. Yeah, he's just a legendary figure, and I just consider it a privilege that I've got to see him live at least once. But also just that we have just like this, we just have this gold mine of so many incredible songs, so many incredible albums, and the fact that so many movies have chosen to employ his music. Even movies like The Big Lebowski used Bob Dylan to great effect, because Joel Cohen, who directed that, is a massive Bob Dylan freak, and obviously loosely based the movie Inside Llewyn Davis, on a lot of figures from that period. But if you like A Complete Unknown, Inside Llewyn Davis is another movie which explores the exact same period, the exact same scene. It's just a character who happens not to become Bob Dylan. He just becomes yet another, also ran within the folk scene. And as far as the career of Timothée Chalamet is concerned, he might look back on 2024 as the best year of his career, where I feel like he is perfectly carving his own path, where he's doing franchises, but he's doing cool franchises like Dune, but he's also doing the character-driven movies like this. And he's kind of getting the best of both worlds, or getting to have his cake and eat it too, where he can do the more artistic films, he can also do the mainstream blockbuster successes. And as everybody knows, Leonardo DiCaprio gave him some great advice years ago, where he said, don't do any superhero movies, and don't do any hard drugs. And it seems like he's following that advice to a T. And I guess the question is, who are his rivals, and as far as being like the biggest young male movie star in their 20s? And obviously Austin Butler is on a very similar trajectory, where I feel like he's also doing movies like Dune Part 2, obviously, where he played Fade Rautha, and he also got to play Elvis. Like, there are a lot of parallels between Austin Butler and Timothée Chalamet, and I like them both. I feel like the sky's the limit as far as both of their careers are concerned, and Austin Butler recently booked the gig of playing Patrick Bateman in Luca Guadagnino's new version of American Psycho, or I shouldn't say new version, or fresh adaptation of the Bret Easton Ellis novel. So I feel like a little competition goes a long way. And if Timothée Chalamet and Austin Butler want to remain competitors to each other, kind of like how James Dean and Marlon Brando and Montgomery Clift were all rivals back in the 1950s. And I like the idea of these guys. We've already seen them fight with their knives in Dune Part 2, and now we get to see their careers go to war to see who will have the more successful career. But also, the movie business needs young movie stars. Like there's a dearth or a total shortage of young movie stars in their 20s and 30s. And so I'm just glad that Austin Butler and Timothée Chalamet are finding the right filmmakers who can express their best qualities. Because I think Timothée Chalamet, when he's at his best in this movie, is when he's surrounded by a bunch of nerds who are having these angry debates about the distinctions between folk, country, rock, etc. And he just has such withering disdain for these people who just want to put him in his little category and leave him in that category forever. And he just has such scorn for narrow-minded thinking, and I feel like that's where Timothée Chalamet really comes to life. So yeah, this movie, I don't know if it's the best version of Bob Dylan that we'll ever see, but I feel like Timothée Chalamet delivered a fantastic performance. And James Mangold sure as shit delivered a better movie than Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, because I like James Mangold. I thought he did a good job with Ford v Ferrari. I thought he did an excellent job with Logan. I liked what he did with Girl Interrupted and Copland, and what else did he do? Walk the Line. What was the Western he did, the remake? Hang on, I'm blanking on the name of the remake. 3:10 to Yuma, that's what was escaping me. The original from 1957 is a better movie, but it's all based on the story by Elmore Leonard. But Delmer Daves did 3:10 to Yuma in 1957, then James Mangold did it in 2007. But yeah, James Mangold, I'm just glad to see him back on firm footing. That whole Indiana Jones debacle was just a total distraction for his career, and I think he should just stick to doing movies like this where he gets to carve his own path. I know he keeps talking about doing stuff for more stuff for Lucasfilm related to Star Wars and blah, blah, blah. I wish James Mangold would just stay away from any remakes, any franchises, and just try to do as many original films as possible. Because if you have the ability to go off and make cool musical biopics based on best-selling books and that sort of thing, why would you want to go through the drudgery of indulging in franchise filmmaking in the modern Hollywood? I feel like we need a lot more directors making movies outside of franchise extensions and all that crap. And James Mangold at this point has the track record and the clout where he can carve his own path. So I hope this movie will find the audience it deserves, and I hope that, I don't really care so much about awards chatter, even if it is great to recognize the actors and filmmakers and that sort of thing. But I just hope that this movie will sell some tickets, because I'm sick to death of watching the 14th, 15th installment in franchises that once upon a time were cool and now are no longer cool. I want more movies like A Complete Unknown, where at least you can kind of judge it on its own terms, as opposed to, they're just pulling scenes from, a really good movie from 1979 and trying to make it feel fresh and new again. And so, long story short, I think A Complete Unknown is a very solid movie. It's a pretty good movie. Is it on the level of Amadeus? No. Is it on the level of a movie like The Doors? Yeah, sure. And it's definitely above some movies like Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocket Band and some other recent biopics that I was less enthusiastic about. So there it is. That's my long, rambling, just incoherent review of A Complete Unknown. And it's a movie that I look forward to seeing again, if only to see Monica Barbaro again up on the stage, because Monica Barbaro did strange and wonderful things to my brain while she was singing all those old Joan Baez songs. But I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that good stuff. But thanks so much for listening to me ramble about the movie, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.